Episode 2, The Agreement, a short story about a leader who called it alignment, and a direct report who finally told him what it actually was. Leadership isn't learned in classrooms. It's learned in the moments you almost got it wrong and chose differently. Welcome to Leadership in Practice. Short stories, real situations, and the shifts that change everything.
I have always been good at reading a room. Or so I thought. I can tell when energy is low. I can tell when someone's distracted. I can tell when a conversation needs to slow down or when a group is ready to move. It's something I developed over years of running teams, sitting in rooms, watching people. It was honestly one of the things I was quietly proud of. My name is Daniel, Chief Commercial Officer at a software company with about 300 people. I'd been in the role for just over 2 years, brought in to lead a strategic repositioning, shifting us from a transactional sales model toward long-term enterprise partnerships. A significant change, the kind that touches everything: how we sell, how we measure success, how we hire, how we talk about ourselves in the market. Big change, real stakes. And after 6 months of working sessions, leadership offsites, cross-functional workshops, we had a plan. A good one, I believed, and more importantly, we had alignment. I was certain of it. The meeting where we finalized the strategy was one of those sessions that just flows. You know the ones. The conversation moves well, people are building on each other's ideas. There's energy in the room. At the end, I went around the table and asked each person directly, "Are you in? Can you commit to this direction?" And they said yes, every one of them. Some enthusiastically, some with a nod and a, "Yes, let's do it." One or two with the kind of measured, considered tone that I read as the seriousness of someone who had genuinely thought it through. I left that meeting feeling, for the first time in months, like we were actually ready. Like the hard part, getting everyone pointed in the same direction, was behind us. I sent a note to the CEO that evening. Strategy confirmed, team aligned, execution begins Monday. Execution did begin Monday, and for about 3 weeks, things looked fine. People were moving, actions were being taken. There were status updates and kickoff calls and a new slide deck with the refreshed strategic pillars. But somewhere around week 4, I started noticing something. The actions were happening, but something underneath them felt thin. Like the motion was real, but the momentum wasn't. Decisions that should have been straightforward were coming back to me for sign-off. Conversations that should have been energizing felt strangely flat. And in some parts of the business, the old ways of working were quietly continuing alongside the new ones, as if the strategy was being run in parallel with everything that came before it, rather than replacing it. I told myself it was transition friction, normal. Change takes time. But then I had a coffee with Tom. Tom was my head of sales, 15 years in the industry, deeply respected by his team, occasionally frustrating to work with because he had opinions and he shared them, which in most rooms I actually valued. We met on a Thursday afternoon, one of our regular one-on-ones. I had an agenda, updates on the enterprise pipeline, some thoughts on resourcing. The usual. We got through maybe half of it, and then there was a pause and Tom said, "Can I say something that's a bit outside the agenda?" I said, "Of course." He looked at me for a moment, then he said, "I don't think we actually agreed to the strategy." I kept my face neutral, but something in my chest did a quiet thing. "What do you mean?" I said. We went around the table, everyone committed. Tom nodded slowly. "I know, I was there." I said yes too. "So, Daniel," he said, "you asked us in front of each other, after 6 months of work, after you'd already briefed the CEO, after the deck was basically done." He paused. "What were we going to say?" I sat with that for a moment. What were we going to say? It's such a simple observation, and yet it had never, not once, occurred to me in those terms. I had designed what I thought was a moment of genuine collective commitment. But from where Tom was sitting, from where all of them were sitting, it was something else entirely. It was a moment where the direction was already set, the social pressure was high, and saying no would have meant being the person who derailed 6 months of work in front of their peers. So they said yes, not because they were dishonest, not because they were passive, but because I had, without realizing it, built a situation where yes was the only viable answer. "What did you actually think?" I asked him. "About the strategy." He was quiet for a second. "I think the direction is right," he said carefully. "Honestly, I do. But there are 2 or 3 assumptions baked into it that I think are wrong. And I didn't say so because the moment didn't feel like it was asking for that." "What assumptions?" I said, and he told me. They were good, sharp, grounded observations about customer behavior and sales cycle realities that only someone with his experience would carry. Things that, had I heard them 6 months earlier, would have changed at least 2 significant elements of the plan. I had the right person in the room. For 6 months, I had just never created the conditions for him to actually speak. I've thought a lot about what I did wrong, and the honest answer is, I confused the form of alignment with the substance of it. I did all the visible things. I ran workshops. I asked for input. I went around the table. I said the words, "Are you in?" But I had never asked the harder question, the one that actually opens something up rather than closes it down. I had never said, "What's your biggest concern about this?" I had never said, "If this fails, what's the most likely reason?" I had never said, "What would you change if it were entirely your call?" Those questions create a different kind of conversation. They signal that doubt is welcome, that the plan isn't precious, that you're more interested in getting it right than in getting it confirmed. I hadn't asked them, because somewhere, not consciously, but somewhere, I didn't want to open things back up. I wanted to close them, and the team sensed that, and they gave me what I seemed to want: a room full of nods. After my conversation with Tom, I did something uncomfortable. I went back to each member of the leadership team individually, not in a group, one by one. And I told them that I'd been reflecting on how we'd landed the strategy and that I wanted to hear, honestly, what their reservations were. I told them there would be no judgment, that I wasn't looking to reopen everything, but that I needed to understand where the real friction was. Those conversations were some of the most useful I'd had in 2 years in the role. One person told me the success metrics were measuring the wrong things. Another said the cross-functional ownership model was unclear enough that no one was sure who actually had accountability in a conflict. A third said she'd never fully believed one of our core market assumptions, but hadn't wanted to be the skeptic in the room. All of it useful, some of it critical. None of it would have emerged in a group setting where the strategy had already been presented as decided. We didn't tear up the plan, but we made it significantly better, and more importantly, the people executing it now actually owned it. Not because I'd asked them to, but because they'd been given the real chance to shape it. The shift I had to make was quieter than I expected. It wasn't about running better workshops or adding more stages to the process. It was about something more fundamental: my relationship with uncertainty. I had been so focused on projecting confidence that I had inadvertently made doubt unsafe. And in a room where doubt isn't safe, you don't get honesty. You get performance. You get people playing the role of the aligned team member, because that's what the room seems to be calling for. Real alignment, I've come to understand, sounds different. It's slower, it has more friction in it. It sometimes means sitting with a decision that feels messier than you'd like for a little longer than is comfortable. But what comes out the other side is something that can actually hold weight. Something people will fight for in execution, not just nod to in a meeting. Because they actually agreed, not because you asked them if they did. Tom, by the way, has become one of the most valuable voices in any room I run. Not because he changed, he was always like that, direct, experienced, honest. But because I finally built a room where that was an asset instead of an inconvenience. That's the thing about psychological safety. It doesn't just protect the quiet people, it unlocks the ones who were never quiet to begin with, who'd just learned over time that the truth wasn't always what the room was actually asking for.
If you've left a meeting lately feeling like everyone agreed, it might be worth asking yourself whether you created the conditions for disagreement. Not because dissent is the goal, but because without it, you never really know what you've got. Every story in this series begins with a leader who thought they had it figured out, because that's usually where the real learning starts. In the next episode, we'll follow a leader who has always been seen as the expert in the room until the moment that identity becomes the very thing blocking the team from moving forward. If you've ever found it hard to say, "I don't know" out loud, that one's for you. Until then, think about the last room you left feeling aligned and ask yourself, did you create space for the no that never came?